A ship is missing near the Strait of Hormuz. Nobody is claiming responsibility. The crew's status is unclear. The attackers are unknown, at least officially. And this happened on the exact same day that Donald Trump sat down with Xi Jinping in Beijing for what both sides are calling a historic summit. Coincidence? Possibly. But in this part of the world, nothing is ever just a coincidence, because what happened in Beijing on Thursday wasn't just another diplomatic photo opportunity. According to a White House readout, Trump and Xi agreed on two things that are almost never said out loud together. The Strait of Hormuz must remain open and Iran can never have a nuclear weapon. Two sentences, but they carry the weight of an entire geopolitical realignment. To understand why this matters, you need to understand what the Strait of Hormuz actually is. It is a narrow passage barely 21 miles wide at its tightest point between Iran and Oman, and through it flows roughly 20% of all the oil traded on this planet. Every supertanker carrying Saudi crude to Asia, every LNG shipment heading to Europe, every barrel of Iraqi oil, it all passes through that strait. Closing it doesn't just raise petrol prices, it destabilizes economies, it cripples military supply chains. It is, in the truest sense, a weapon. And that weapon has been effectively locked since late February, when the United States went to war with Iran. So when Trump comes out of Beijing saying she wants to help reopen the strait, that's not small talk. That is a structural shift in the balance of pressure on Tehran. China is Iran's biggest oil customer without Chinese demand. Iran's energy revenues collapse. Without those revenues, the Iranian government's ability to fund its military, its proxies, and its nuclear program begins to fracture. If she pulls back even slightly, it changes the entire equation. But this is where the story gets more complicated. Read Xi's promise again very carefully. He told Trump he would not supply military equipment to Iran, military equipment. That phrase is doing a lot of heavy lifting. It says nothing about dual-use technology, the components that can build both civilian infrastructure and weapons systems. It says nothing about financial transactions routed through third-party banks. It says nothing about the oil purchases that continue every single day, providing Tehran with the hard currency it desperately needs. She didn't promise to stop being Iran's economic lifeline. He promised not to hand them guns. And there's a reason analysts in Washington are treating this big statement, as Trump called it, with considerable caution. Because China has made assurances about Iran before, and the architecture of Chinese-Iranian economic ties has proven remarkably difficult to dismantle. Trump, to his credit, appears to understand this is a process, not a conclusion. He told Fox News that she wants to help reopen the Strait of Hormuz. Note the word wants, not will, not has agreed to. Wants, the distinction matters enormously, because wanting something and delivering it are very different things when you're managing a relationship with a country you've cultivated as a strategic partner for over a decade. And here's the part that most people are missing entirely. While Trump and Xi were finalizing their joint statement in Beijing, a ship was being seized near the Strait of Hormuz. Whether or not Iran directly ordered that seizure, which remains unconfirmed, the timing sends a message that Tehran has been sending for years. We can hear every conversation you're having about us, and we can respond before the ink is dry. This is not recklessness. This is calculated signaling. Iran has spent decades developing what strategic analysts call escalation management, the ability to apply pressure in precise doses, in precise locations, at precisely the wrong moment for its adversaries. A ship disappears near the Hormuz, oil markets shudder. Washington's phone lines light up, and suddenly the diplomatic front that Trump is trying to build feels a little less solid. It also puts Xi in an uncomfortable position. If China is seen moving away from Iran publicly through these summit statements and Iran responds by triggering another maritime crisis, Beijing faces an awkward choice. Does it condemn the seizure and risk accelerating its break with Tehran? Or does it stay quiet and undermine the credibility of everything she just told Trump? There is no clean answer, and Iran knows it. Then there's Lebanon. Hours before American brokered talks between Israel and Lebanon began in Washington, Hezbollah launched a drone strike that wounded Israeli civilians. If you want to understand the architecture of what Iran does, this is it in miniature. Tehran doesn't need to fire a single missile directly. It has a network. Hezbollah, Houthi forces in Yemen, militia groups across Iraq that it can activate at will on multiple fronts simultaneously. As the Americans and Chinese were discussing how to contain Iran, Iran was lighting a fire in southern Lebanon to remind everyone that containment is easier discussed than achieved. And that changes everything about how you read this summit. Let's be direct about the stakes. If the Trump-Xi alignment holds, if China genuinely begins pulling back its economic and diplomatic support from Iran, then Tehran faces a level of strategic isolation it hasn't experienced since the peak of Obama-era sanctions. The nuclear program slows, the proxy network becomes underfunded, the regime faces internal pressure. That is the optimistic scenario for Washington. But if Xi's promises prove as narrow as they appear, limited to military hardware while economic support continues, then Iran weathers this moment. It absorbs the diplomatic pressure, continues funding its proxies, continues enriching uranium behind closed doors, and waits. Iran has waited out multiple American administrations. It has waited out European diplomatic initiatives, unresolutions, and military strikes. Waiting is something Tehran does exceptionally well. The question isn't whether Trump and Xi have agreed on a goal. They clearly have. The question is whether Xi is willing to pay the economic cost of actually achieving it. For the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, the way Bahrain, this summit is cautiously welcome news. They have been living under the shadow of an active American-Iranian war with an effectively closed oil route. Every day the Hormuz stays shut, their revenues suffer and their populations feel the pressure. A genuine US-China front against Iran would be the most significant security development in the Gulf in years. For Israel, the picture is more complex. Jerusalem has spent years trying to convince Washington and Beijing to take the Iranian nuclear threat seriously. That both leaders said explicitly that Iran can never have a nuclear weapon is historic on paper. But Israeli analysts will be watching Xi's follow-through with deep skepticism. Israel has been here before, listening to diplomatic assurances that Tehran quietly circumvents. Step back, and what you're watching is something genuinely unprecedented. The United States and China, two countries locked in the deepest strategic rivalry since the Cold War, fighting a bitter trade war, disputing Taiwan's future, competing for dominance across Asia and Africa and the Indo-Pacific, have just issued a joint statement against a third country's nuclear ambitions. That doesn't happen by accident. It happens because both Washington and Beijing have calculated that a nuclear-armed Iran threatens their interests in ways that outweigh their competition with each other. For America, an Iranian bomb means regional proliferation. Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and potentially Egypt would accelerate their own programs. The Middle East, already combustible, becomes an entirely different kind of danger. For China, a nuclear Iran is a chaotic Iran, an energy supplier that could become unpredictable, a Gulf region that could destabilize at any moment, a conflict that could shut the oil routes Beijing depends on to fuel its economy. Neither country can afford that outcome. And that is the hidden logic of what happened in Beijing. Two rivals finding a rare patch of common ground, not out of friendship, not out of trust, but out of cold strategic interest. History suggests we should be careful about reading too much into summits. Trump and Kim Jong-un shook hands in Singapore and the Korean Peninsula. Did not denuclearize. The Iran nuclear deal of 2015 unraveled despite years of careful diplomacy. Agreements made in gilded rooms have a habit of dissolving on contact with reality. But something genuinely different may be happening here. For the first time, the two countries with the most leverage over Iran, its biggest oil customer, and the nation that funds its adversaries, are aligned on the outcome they want. That is not nothing. That is potentially everything. The ship near the Hormuz is still moving. toward Iranian waters. The war between America and Iran is still active. The world's most critical oil passage is still effectively closed. And somewhere in Beijing, Xi Jinping is calculating exactly how much of what he promised he actually intends to deliver. That calculation, more than any summit, more than any White House readout, is what determines what happens next, not just in the Gulf, not just to the price of oil, but to the entire architecture of global power that has been shifting quietly and irreversibly for the last decade. Watch this space, because the next move belongs to Tehran and they rarely telegraph it in advance.